Welcome to the Wharton Sports Business Initiative video blog. I'm Andrew Brandt along with Scott Rosner, and here we are to talk about the passing of one of the greats of sports law and sports business, someone who changed the game, someone who did for player rights what maybe no one had done before and perhaps no one has done since in changing the ability of players to ask for things and eventually get things from owners and from teams. Scott, Marvin Miller passed away. And there are some people out there that may not know that name. It may be at their tip of the tongue, but they should. Anyone who's interested in sports, because as I said, he was a difference maker. He changed the game.
Absolutely. And if you think about the Mount Rushmore of sports business figures, he is front and center.
Yeah.
For those, fighting for the rights of the athletes, starting obviously in baseball, and then that obviously carried over to the other leagues. And he's had a monumental impact on the business of sports. Players, when he became the executive director of the Players Association in 1966, were earning $10,000 at a minimum salary. Now the minimum salary in 2013 is $490,000. Average salary in 2013 is going to be over $3 million for Major League Baseball players.
You know, when you and I teach about this and we talk about it, before the 1960s, 70s, there really was not. Players were reserved to their team at essentially the same contract they had before, whether they hit 30 home runs or 60 home runs or 10 home runs, and they ended up being reserved in perpetuity. There were no rights. There were no rights of free agency or anything like this. Miller changed that. Sort of take us through the time frame of what changed when and how we get to where we are now in baseball.
Sure. So if you go back to the very beginning in professional baseball, the formation of the National League in 1976, the institution of the reserve system a short time thereafter. And for that period of time, as you alluded to, up until for about a century, really, players were in a perpetual take it or leave it situation. The infamous statement to Ralph Kiner, "Well, we finished in fourth place with you," and so the players were always left in a spot where the team dictated to them the terms of their employment going forward. Miller becomes the head of the Players Association in baseball in 1966. Players don't even have basic rights at that point. Players at the time in baseball were afraid of appointing an economist from the steelworkers to become the head of their Players Association, fearing someone the old cigar chomping union type of individual, not realizing obviously that while Miller, while a very slight man, was a very powerful man and a very smart man. Then we go to the 68 agreement and the 1970 agreement, where players go from not having any arbitration rights, something that's a given in every unionized workplace, to having arbitration rights. At first, those arbitration rights were not determined by a neutral arbitrator, believe it or not. They had to fight for the right to get a neutral third party to determine the outcome of any grievances that would be filed. Then we go to the early 1970s, the landmark, of course, 1972 decision in Flood v. Kuhn, which, as our students know, but many don't know, the players actually lost.
Went against Kuhn. It went against Kurt Flood.
It went against Flood. Kuhn won. And so then they have to resort to grievance arbitration to try to gain economic parity with the owners. Ultimately, arbitrator cites rules in favor of Messersmith and McNally. The players gain the right to dismantle the reserve system, and then it's left to collective bargaining and the subsequent negotiation to figure out exactly how the system would be dismantled. There was some thought that, well, let every player become a free agent at the end of each year. That actually works against the basic rules of supply and demand from a player's perspective, right? You'd have closer to equilibrium between supply of players entering the marketplace and demand by the teams in the league for those players. So Miller says, well, why don't we stagger the entrance into the free agent market, wait till after 6 years. There had already been a salary arbitration mechanism in place that was started in the prior collective bargaining agreement for players who couldn't come to a salary agreement with the teams. That continued, plus you add free agency to the mix in 1976, and it never looked back, right? Player salaries growing from an average then in 76 of $52,000 a year roughly up to the in excess of $3 million that we alluded to before. And then that's the baseball story.
Yeah.
All of the other leagues eventually follow suit.
Yeah, and you mentioned the word suit. It almost took these suits to do it, but it wouldn't have happened without what Miller created on the baseball side. We have the Reggie White v. NFL case that created free agency in the NFL. We have the Bridgman case that created free agency in the NBA. And following up on your point, this staggered free agent system, that has become commonplace. Now in football, you need those 4 years. In basketball, you need those 4 years, and you have this restricted period before that. Like you said, it sounds great if everyone's free agent, but then you flood the market, you have too much supply, not enough demand. Miller was aware of that, and he created that. Hall of Fame discussion, okay? He's not in the Hall of Fame. We have to deal with this. Every Marvin Miller conversation, you have to deal with this. First of all, in your opinion, why is Marvin Miller, one of the seminal greats in the sport of baseball, not in the Hall of Fame, and will that change with his passing?
Well, I think it's ludicrous that he's not in the Hall of Fame. If you think about his contributions to the game of baseball over the course of his career, I don't think you can find anyone who had a greater impact on the game in the last 50 years than Marvin Miller did.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the reason why he's not in, and this has been talked about in a lot of other places as well, is this notion that there's an axe to grind against him, that somehow what he did was bad for the game. Well, what he did was bad for the owners because he actually allowed the labor force to get fair market value for their services. But what he did for the game has been everlasting and a monumental contribution. I do expect him to be inducted into the Hall of Fame posthumously. I think it's a shame that he will not be able to participate in the induction ceremonies. But I think at this point there's there never has been, and there certainly is not now, any reason for him to be kept out of the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, I mean, let's hope those petty concerns, whatever they are now past us.
One would hope.
Yeah, and I think the last thing to point out is that his legacy lives on embodied in Don Fehr, his successor at the baseball union, who is now leading the hockey union in the midst of their lockout as we sit here on November 28th with that still in full blow. We'll talk about it as we go forward, but it's not going anywhere there, and Fehr is zealously protecting the rights of players, as was his mentor, Marvin Miller.
Absolutely, and his legacy carries on. I spent an hour and 20 minutes prior to filming this in a classroom talking about athlete compensation in professional sports.
Yeah.
Ironic to do so the day after the passing of Marvin Miller.
Yeah, and I think everything you and myself, we talk about, collective bargaining, free agency, players' rights, burgeoning salaries, we can owe a debt to Marvin Miller.
Absolutely, and without question.
For the Wharton Sports Video Vlog, I'm Andrew Brand along with Scott Rosner.